Welcome back to Bankole Nation. I'm your host, Bankole Thompson. Coming up on this week's edition, we're talking about the legacy of Pope Francis, the 88-year-old pontiff who died on Monday, Easter Monday, at the Vatican. What his impact and legacy means to the world, and of course, the challenge it provides for the city of Detroit here and the state of Michigan. One of the globe's, if not this era's most important voice for economic justice had passed away. Our analysis comes right after this break. Stay with us for Bankole's Nation. Welcome back to Bankole's Nation. I'm your host, Bankole Thompson. Thank you so much for joining us for the resumption of this weekly podcast here, Bankole's Nation, after what I consider to be over a period of several weeks of much needed rest. I'm back to our weekly conversation. And of course, we begin with the announcement earlier this week that Pope Francis had died at the Vatican. Of course, Pope Francis was ill for a while. And I want to talk about Pope Francis and his impact because I think it's important. Much has been said about what he did and what he stood for within the Catholic Church. But also, I think Pope Francis's death is a reminder of the need for leaders within and outside the church to use their platform to champion issues that are ignored. Many people have indicated the fact that the church, the modern church, and that is whether it's the Catholic Church, the Baptist Church, interdenominational, Pentecostal, whatever it is, that the church is not as relevant in the life of a given community as it should be. And so, of course, we've seen also reports about the dwindling of church membership. The Catholic Church has been racked by a sexual abuse scandal. Other churches have been challenged by other challenges, and there's been a declination. In fact, I cited a Pew Research in one of my Detroit News columns showing why some churches have been losing membership. And so the church is called to stand up and to speak for what is right and to speak truth to power. And I think that's why Pope Francis's legacy is being felt all across the world. Pope Francis took on the Catholic Church at a time when it needed a leader to reform the church, not only reform it in terms of the sex abuse scandal, but really make the church an important part of the life of the larger community. What I appreciate about Pope Francis has been his stance on economic justice as a defender of the poor, as a defender of marginalized communities, as a defender of migrants. Pope Francis has not been shy to speak out, to share what he truly believes is his conviction, and of course, challenging the conscience of powerful people as well. Perhaps in the modern era, we've not seen a pope who has been so courageous, who has been so outspoken, who has not look the other way when it comes to all of these issues that we talk about, issues of income inequality, the fate of the homeless, veterans. And when you look at Detroit, and I indicated this in my Detroit News column coming out on Thursday about just how much of the issues that Pope Francis championed from the Vatican are issues that are playing out in the city of Detroit, where income inequality is a significant issue, where child poverty rate in Detroit is over 40%, where the homelessness rate in Detroit is astronomical, where you have all kinds of issues challenging our leaders. These are issues that Pope Francis challenged or took on from the Vatican. And I think it's significant that as we reflect upon his legacy, it's important for us to also look at what he did, but also to look at the example of a man who was bestowed with a powerful platform as the leader of a church that has a membership of 1.4 billion people, who did not confine himself to the ivory tower of the Catholic Church, who did not confine himself to the mahogany offices of the papacy in Rome, but one who actually stretched out beyond the bounds of the Vatican to visit prisoners, to visit the homeless, to comfort those who were sick, and really speak to the hearts and minds of people. And that that is the kind of leadership that I think we need in this era. Leadership that is not afraid, leadership that is willing to speak truth to power, leadership that is willing to stand up for what is right. And most of the time within our religious community, that kind of leadership is very rare. When I look at Pope Francis, what he did and what he stood for and how he spoke truth to power, it reminds me of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He had the undying love for humanity of Dr. King. He had the courage of a Nelson Mandela. And that is what Pope Francis embodied. And I think it needs to be put in context. Think about it. Has there been any leader of the Catholic Church or any leader of a major religious denomination in the modern era who has championed economic justice, income equality, the fate of the homeless, marginalized communities, people who have been confined to what I call a perennial underclass? Has there been any leader of any major religious organization in the world that has done that more than Pope Francis? Think about it. I don't think we can think of anyone. That is what has made, I think, Pope Francis's reign, his 12-year reign at the Vatican, a rarity. It's rare. It's rare. And I know it takes courage to be able to do the things that Pope Francis did, but also I think it's a lesson that when you have power, you have to use it. I think we find ourselves in a situation where we see leaders who have power, but really don't want to use the power. We see leaders who are entrusted with power, but refuse to use power. And if they do, it is not in service of others. If they do, it is not for the benefit of the majority of the people who would be impacted by how they use that power. And that is what makes the leadership of Pope Francis at the Vatican so unique. Because he used the platform, he used his position on the global stage as the indispensable leader of the Catholic Church, as this era's most prominent anti-poverty voice on the global stage, to challenge the conscience of those who have the resources and the access to resources to do for the least of these. I read some of the messages that Pope Francis will send to Davos, the annual gathering of the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he challenged the world's wealthiest to consider communities that have been plundered of their resources, to consider communities that have been exploited of their resources and left to benefit nothing from that plunder. And that plunder only enabled a few people to be rich, only enabled a few people to use those resources, extract resources from communities and not use it in service of those communities. Pope Francis talked about that. In fact, he said it last year at the 2024 World Economic Forum. That was his message to Davos, to prick the conscience of the ultra wealthy, the most powerful in the world, to realize that they have a responsibility to look at the communities in which their businesses are and where their businesses are operating. And frankly, when we look at Detroit, like I indicated in this podcast, Detroit, the issues that we face in the Motor City are issues that Pope Francis had championed. Pope Francis could have issued what, could have issued an encyclical on Detroit. Because Detroit is the belly of the beast. Detroit is an urban center that is challenged economically. The battlefield for economic justice in Detroit is in need of voices like Pope Francis. It's in need of religious leaders, faith leaders who are willing to speak out, who are not willing to keep quiet. It's in need of faith leaders who are willing to speak out in broad daylight like Pope Francis did, and not have to be like Nicodemus in the middle of the night, running scared, and making sure nobody sees them, their alliances. You all know what I'm talking about. Let me put it in plain vernacular. Y'all know what I'm talking about. Unlike Pope Francis, what we have for the most part sometimes are religious leaders who act like Nicodemus in the night. They don't want to come out and say anything because they don't want to upset the apple cart. They don't want to upset the status quo. They don't want to make the governor mad. They don't want to make the mayor mad. They don't want to make the power structure mad. And in so doing, they keep quiet. In so doing, they refuse to say what needs to be said. I think it was the Theodore Parker who said that the price that honest men pay for keeping quiet is to have dishonest men write ink with blood on white paper, something to that effect. Pope Francis was an honest man who did not keep quiet. He was an honest man who was driven by his conviction to speak. Dr. King, when he went to the Riverside Church to give his speech Beyond Vietnam, as he mounted the pulpit at the Riverside Church in New York, Dr. King said, he was there to speak out because the mandate of his conscience leave him no choice but to speak. Pope Francis took over the reins of leadership at the Vatican, spoke because the mandate of his conscience left him no choice but to speak truth to power. He talked about the fact that, when homeless people are dead, or when somebody who is poor dies, in a place like Detroit, any other place around the world, the bells on NASDAQ don't ring. They ring when the profits are being made. Astronomical profits are being made. There's nothing wrong in making profits. But there's something wrong when those profits don't benefit the communities where those profits are coming from. That's why Pope Francis's papacy was so important, because he spoke directly to naked economic exploitation. Whether it's in Detroit, whether it was in Chicago, whether it was in communities in Asia, communities in Africa, communities in Italy, in Europe, around the world, Pope Francis spoke to the urgency to address naked economic exploitation. I reference in my Detroit News column about, Detroit, an epicenter where billionaires come groveling for taxpayer dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in tax subsidies. Why does a man who's worth billions of dollars need to grovel, need to extract hundreds of millions of dollars in public tax subsidies to build a fanciful project? Those are things that Pope Francis did not stand for. But do we have religious leaders in Detroit who are willing to speak with the level of courage that Pope Francis showed, who are willing to speak out in the way Pope Francis did, use their platform, use their pulpits to say what needs to be said? Or what do we have? Religious leaders who, like Nicodemus, the biblical story, in the middle of the night, scared to death, Don't want to come out, only comes out at night. Don't want you to see their associations and their public alliances. And this is the challenge. And so as we think about the legacy of Pope Francis, which stretches beyond the Catholic Church itself, and I indicated that it was Pope Francis who reignited my interest in the Catholic Church, because we've not seen in the modern era a religious leader with such enormous power in this age who has been willing to use the full force of that power to lay claim to the questions of economic justice. So we have to think about what this all means. So it is not the Catholic Church that only has lost a leader. The Catholic Church is not the only institution that has lost a shepherd. The wider community of economic justice, the wider community of justice has lost a towering soldier, a general in the field for economic equality. And the challenge for us in Detroit is to continue to push the envelope for economic justice. The challenge for us in Detroit is to make sure that kids who are homeless don't find themselves confined in a casino parking lot and had to die because they had no place to lay their head at night. Like the two Black kids that I talked about on this podcast and also wrote about in my Detroit News columns. When those kids died in Detroit, I attended their funeral at Triumph Church, where Reverend Solomon Kenlock gave the eulogy. When they died, the bells in NASDAQ did not ring because their life means nothing. To many, or to some, who don't see homelessness or who don't see the need to address this burgeoning crisis of homelessness in the city of Detroit and in the state of Michigan. So it's nice to express our condolences to the Vatican, to every member of the Catholic Church. But it's another thing to remind ourselves of the need to emulate the exemplary leadership that Pope Francis had demonstrated on the world stage, and how he was willing to confront his critics, powerful people, and force them to look at themselves in the mirror and ask the Socratic question, what is my legacy? If I die with all this wealth, if I die worth billions of dollars, I'm not taking my billions of dollars to the grave. What is my legacy? Pope Francis's legacy is asking you that question. What is my legacy? Pope Francis forced powerful people to look at themselves in the mirror and reckon with their legacy on the most important questions of inequality that is facing our era. Yes, you're worth billions of dollars. You're not going to take that to the grave. They're going to put you in a small wooden box and bury you inside the earth. You're not taking your billions of dollars to the grave. You're not taking those powerful positions in politics and economics to the grave. None of those titles are going to the grave with you. So what is your legacy? And I think that's what Pope Francis did during his reign at the Vatican. He forced powerful people to look at themselves in the mirror and ask themselves, what am I worth? What do I want to be remembered for? We know what Francis is going to be remembered for. We know what Martin Luther King Jr. will be remembered for. We know what Mother Teresa will be remembered for. We know what Nelson Mandela will be remembered for. But what would the religious leaders in Detroit be remembered for? What would the political leaders of Detroit be remembered for? What would the mayor of Detroit, Mike Duggan, be remembered for? What would the governor of Michigan, how will the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, be remembered for? Those are the questions we have to ask ourselves. What would I, Bankole Thompson, be remembered for? We know what Pope Francis is going to be remembered for. At the end of the day, when the candle light is dim, the question will be asked, what have you done with your life? And so the world celebrates Pope Francis, who will be funeralized on Saturday at the Vatican. The world mourns a leader who did not hold back, who lived a rewarding and a fulfilled life. But there are so many dimensions, so many examples we can pick from the leadership of Pope Francis. So if anything, in Detroit, let's remember that there is much work to be done. There's the unfinished business of addressing the questions of economic injustice, the poverty crisis in the city of Detroit that has become so pervasive. All across the state, from Detroit, Pontiac, Flint, Benton Harbor, Saginaw, you name it. All of those challenges are waiting to be attended. So I say to you, if you're listening to this podcast, it makes no sense to lament about what you couldn't do when you had the power. You have the power now. Use your voice, use your resources, use your proximity to power, use your ability, your God-given gifts in addressing the burning questions of the day, the very questions that Pope Francis chose as his ministry at the Vatican. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you for another edition of Bankole's Nation.